For years, the small lakeside community had been quiet. Not the kind of quiet that felt empty or lonely, but the kind people moved there hoping to find. The road curved gently around the lake, lined with modest cabins, wooden docks, and trees that swayed slowly whenever the wind rolled across the water. People waved to each other when they passed. Neighbors borrowed tools, watched each other's houses during vacations, and occasionally gathered on porches to watch the sunset reflect across the lake. And for the most part, the Homeowners Association existed quietly in the background. Like most HOAs, it had rules, parking guidelines, noise policies, restrictions on how properties could be used. But for years those rules had mostly stayed on paper, until suddenly they didn't. It started small. A notice appeared in the mailbox one afternoon. Nothing aggressive at first, just a reminder about the number of vehicles allowed to park near the cabin during gatherings. Technically, the rule had always existed somewhere in the HOA handbook, buried among dozens of other guidelines most residents barely remembered. At first, the notice felt harmless. The cabin's driveway comfortably held 3 cars, and friends occasionally visited on weekends. Nothing loud, no parties, just people enjoying the lake and good conversation. But only a few days later, another letter arrived. This one was different. The wording sounded more formal, almost official. It warned about unauthorized gatherings and referenced multiple HOA clauses related to parking limits, community tranquility, and residential usage restrictions. Reading it twice didn't make it clearer. Nothing happening at the cabin seemed remotely close to violating those rules. Yet the warnings continued. Soon the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time a couple of cars appeared in the driveway, another notice followed. Every time friends stopped by for coffee or conversation, the HOA seemed to know almost immediately. Someone was watching. Around the neighborhood, it wasn't difficult to guess who. One HOA board member had developed a reputation for taking rules far more seriously than anyone else. Residents often saw her slowly driving through the neighborhood roads, eyes scanning driveways and docks like she was conducting inspections. At first people joked about it, but when the letters began arriving at the cabin regularly, the situation stopped being funny. Another notice appeared warning that repeated violations could lead to fines. The amount listed underneath the warning was surprisingly high, and suddenly the situation felt deliberate. Neighbors started quietly sharing similar experiences. Small fines issued over minor things. Warnings about parking, porch furniture placement, even decorative lights. Most people simply paid the fines and moved on, because challenging the HOA usually meant headaches no one wanted. But the pressure around the cabin kept building. Then the fine arrived. It came early one morning, printed in bold lettering across the top of the notice. According to the HOA, the property had hosted an unauthorized gathering exceeding neighborhood regulations. The fine listed beneath the accusation was large enough to get anyone's attention. The problem was, the gathering they were referencing had barely been a gathering at all, just a quiet meeting inside the cabin. A few people around a table discussing lake regulations and environmental policies affecting shoreline communities. Nothing loud, nothing disruptive. Yet somehow it had already been reported. Emails were sent to the HOA asking for clarification. Responses came slowly, and when they did, they repeated the same explanation. The violation had been documented. The fine would stand. It felt less like a conversation and more like arguing with a wall. Meanwhile, the watchful attention around the cabin only increased. Neighbors noticed the same car passing more frequently, sometimes slowing near the driveway, sometimes stopping briefly down the road. It was clear the situation had become personal. But the moment that would change everything arrived the week another meeting was scheduled at the cabin. This one had nothing to do with the HOA. Several people planned to gather privately to discuss regional environmental regulations that were beginning to affect lakeside communities across the state. Important discussions about shoreline management and policy changes that could impact hundreds of homeowners. That afternoon, several vehicles parked in the driveway. Inside the cabin, the meeting began quietly. Documents spread across the table. Coffee cups rested beside stacks of paperwork. The lake shimmered outside the windows as the group discussed complicated legal policies affecting shoreline development. From the outside, the house looked completely ordinary. But somewhere down the road, someone had already noticed the parked cars. And within the hour, a report had been made. A car pulled up near the driveway. The familiar HOA board member stepped out, holding a thick folder filled with HOA documents, violation notices, and printed regulations. From her perspective, the situation looked obvious. Multiple cars, a gathering, another violation. She walked toward the cabin with the confidence of someone who believed she had the authority to stop what was happening. Inside, no one noticed her approaching. The conversation continued around the table. Discussions about regulations, legal authority, and how certain policies might affect private homeowners across the region. Outside, the tension was building. Neighbors watching quietly from porches noticed the board member climbing the cabin steps with determined purpose. Everyone in the community knew what usually happened when she decided to enforce something personally. She reached the door. Without knocking, she pushed it open. The door slammed against the wall with a loud crack. Inside, the room went silent. The conversation stopped instantly as everyone turned toward the doorway. Standing there was the HOA board member, clutching her folder of documents. Her expression carried absolute certainty. She began stepping forward, clearly ready to deliver the speech she had prepared about unauthorized gatherings, HOA rules, and violations. But something about the room felt different. No one looked guilty. No one looked nervous. The people sitting around the table simply watched her. Then her eyes moved across the room and stopped. The man sitting across from the homeowner looked calm, professional, composed. For a moment, recognition didn't register. But as she looked closer, her confidence disappeared. Because the man she had just interrupted wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't a guest. And he definitely wasn't someone concerned about HOA parking rules. He was the state attorney general. The silence inside the cabin became almost unbearable. Only seconds earlier she had walked in believing she was the authority in the room. Now she stood in the middle of a legal meeting involving one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the entire state. The folder in her hands suddenly looked very small. Around the table, the participants remained calm, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Because the meeting she had just interrupted wasn't about neighborhood rules at all. It was about state-level environmental policy affecting shoreline communities. And ironically, one of the topics already being discussed involved complaints from homeowners across several HOAs about aggressive enforcement practices. Complaints about excessive fines, harassment, board members overstepping their authority. In that moment, the situation flipped completely. The person who had spent weeks trying to control the cabin had just walked directly into a legal discussion about abuse of HOA power. Over the next several days, the entire neighborhood started hearing about what happened. At first, the story sounded unbelievable. But as more details surfaced, residents began realizing something important. The situation wasn't just about one cabin anymore. Many people had quietly experienced similar pressure. Small fines, strange warnings, the uncomfortable feeling that someone from the HOA was constantly watching. Within a week, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. Attendance was higher than anyone had ever seen. Neighbors filled the room asking questions. How were enforcement decisions made? Who decided when fines were issued? Did board members actually have the authority to confront residents the way it had happened to the cabin? The answers weren't clear. And that uncertainty changed everything. Within months, the HOA introduced new policies. Fines required multiple board approvals. Board members were discouraged from confronting residents directly. And most importantly, the association clarified the limits of its authority. Private homes were still private homes. HOA rules could guide shared spaces, but they could not control every aspect of a homeowner's life. The fine against the cabin was dismissed. Others were quietly dropped as well. And the board member who had pushed hardest for aggressive enforcement stepped away from her position soon after. Eventually someone else took the role. Someone focused more on community than control. Today, the cabin looks exactly as it always did. Sunlight glitters across the lake behind it. Friends occasionally park in the driveway. Neighbors stop by to talk on the porch. And no one feels the need to count how many cars are there anymore. Because the entire conflict changed something deeper in the community. People remembered why they moved there in the first place. Not to watch each other. Not to enforce rulebooks like law enforcement. But to live quietly beside the water. And sometimes, all it takes to remind a community of that balance is one person opening the wrong door at the wrong moment and discovering the authority they believed they had was never really theirs to begin with. No one expects a quiet suburban driveway to become the center of a battle that would divide an entire neighborhood. No one imagines that a single parked car could expose how fragile fairness really is when power goes unchecked. But one morning, in a community where rules were enforced more strictly than kindness, an ordinary homeowner walked outside and realized his life had just been turned into a warning example. A car blocked his driveway completely, placed there with deliberate confidence by someone who believed authority protected her from consequences. What followed wasn't just an argument about parking. It became a fight over control, reputation, and the question every homeowner eventually faces: what happens when the people enforcing the rules decide they don't apply to themselves? The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside. Tree-lined streets, curved around identical homes, painted in carefully approved colors. Lawns were trimmed to uniform heights, mailboxes matched, and sidewalks stayed spotless. The Homeowners Association promoted the community as a model of order and harmony, a place where property values stayed high because standards were strictly maintained. Daniel Harper had moved there 3 years earlier, seeking stability after a long period of uncertainty. At 38, he valued quiet routines and predictable days. He worked remotely as an IT consultant, which meant most of his time was spent at home, surrounded by the calm he had intentionally chosen. The neighborhood felt safe, organized, and peaceful, exactly what he wanted. He followed the HOA rules carefully. Trash bins went out only at approved hours. Landscaping stayed neat. Exterior lights matched community guidelines. Daniel wasn't trying to stand out. He simply wanted to live comfortably without conflict. At first, the HOA felt distant and mostly invisible. Monthly emails arrived with reminders about seasonal decorations or lawn maintenance. Nothing unusual for a managed community. Residents waved politely during evening walks, and disputes seemed non-existent. One name appeared frequently in HOA communications: Linda Carver. Linda served as the association's enforcement chair, a role that gave her authority to monitor violations and issue citations. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her constant presence, walking streets with a clipboard, photographing properties, reminding residents about compliance. Some admired her dedication. Others quietly avoided her. Daniel's first interaction with Linda had been brief and polite, a reminder about a recycling bin left visible too long. He corrected it immediately, assuming that was the end of it. But over time, her attention toward his property seemed to increase. Small notices began appearing. A warning about hedge height that differed by inches. A reminder regarding driveway markings that no other neighbor received. Each issue felt minor, yet the frequency created unease. Daniel complied every time, believing cooperation would resolve whatever concern existed. Instead, the scrutiny intensified. Then came the morning everything changed. Daniel stepped outside with his coffee and froze. A silver sedan sat directly across his driveway entrance, blocking it completely. There was no space to exit, no visible attempt to park considerately. The placement felt intentional. The vehicle belonged to Linda. At first, Daniel assumed it was temporary, maybe maintenance work or a short visit nearby. He waited. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. His scheduled appointment approached, and frustration replaced patience. He contacted the HOA using the official reporting process, expecting a simple resolution. The response shocked him. The HOA informed him that Linda was conducting community enforcement duties and that temporary parking exceptions were permitted under operational authority. No timeline was provided. No apology offered. Daniel stared at the message, trying to understand how blocking a resident's driveway could qualify as enforcement work. Hours passed before the car moved. The next day, a violation notice appeared in his mailbox, citing him for improper communication with HOA leadership and warning of escalating penalties for non-cooperative behavior. Confusion turned into concern. Daniel reviewed community bylaws carefully and found nothing allowing board members to obstruct private property access. He submitted a formal appeal, attaching photos and timestamps. Instead of resolution, fines followed. Each notice carried increasing penalties. Language grew sharper, framing him as disruptive. Emails went unanswered. Requests for meetings were delayed repeatedly. What had begun as inconvenience evolved into pressure. Neighbors noticed, but remained silent. Some offered sympathetic looks, yet avoided involvement. The HOA's authority discouraged confrontation, and most residents preferred peace over participation. Daniel felt increasingly isolated. Then another incident occurred. Linda parked near his driveway again during what she described as an inspection. Though not fully blocking access this time, the message felt clear. Authority allowed behavior others would never risk. Daniel installed a small security camera facing his driveway, hoping documentation would protect him. Within days, another violation arrived accusing him of installing unauthorized surveillance equipment. The pattern became undeniable. Every attempt to defend himself triggered another penalty. Finis accumulati rapidly. A certified letter warned that continued non-compliance could result in a lien against his property. Fear replaced frustration. A lien threatened not just finances, but ownership itself. Daniel realized this conflict was no longer about parking. It had become a demonstration of control. He began documenting everything meticulously: timestamps, photographs, emails, and notices. Late nights were spent researching HOA governance laws and homeowner rights. The deeper he looked, the more inconsistencies he discovered. Rules existed, but enforcement appeared selective. Then a turning point arrived. While reviewing public HOA records, Daniel noticed multiple complaints filed years earlier against enforcement practices that quietly disappeared without resolution. Patterns mirrored his own experience. Escalating fines following personal disagreements. He wasn't the first. Armed with evidence, Daniel requested a formal hearing before the board, triggering procedures that required documentation review under legal oversight. The hearing changed everything. Instead of emotional confrontation, the process unfolded through evidence. Photos displayed the blocked driveway. Email timelines revealed unanswered appeals. Financial records showed penalties issued faster than allowed under HOA guidelines. Linda maintained that enforcement authority justified her actions. But documentation told a different story. Board members began asking questions, not about Daniel's compliance, but about enforcement procedures themselves. For the first time, uncertainty appeared within the leadership structure. The hearing concluded without immediate judgment, but something had shifted. The conflict was no longer personal. It had become institutional. Days later, the HOA announced an independent audit of enforcement actions. Silence followed. No new fines arrived. Communication paused. The neighborhood watched quietly as attorneys reviewed years of records. Residents began sharing stories. Similar experiences surfaced, minor disputes escalating into costly penalties. What once seemed isolated now appeared systemic. The audit findings confirmed widespread procedural violations. Enforcement actions lacked consistency. Documentation showed authority sometimes used in personal disputes. Linda stepped down pending investigation. All fines against Daniel were rescinded. The threatened lien disappeared. The HOA issued formal acknowledgement that enforcement standards had not been followed properly. Relief came slowly. The driveway returned to normal. Mornings regained routine. Stress that once lingered daily began fading. Community reforms followed. Independent review became mandatory for violations. Meetings were recorded. Transparency replaced assumption. Participation increased as residents realized governance required involvement, not blind trust. Months later, Linda quietly sold her home and left the neighborhood. Daniel never sought revenge. What mattered was balance restored. Neighbors began talking openly again. HOA meetings shifted tone from enforcement to collaboration. Compliance improved because rules felt fair rather than punitive. Standing in his driveway one evening, Daniel reflected on how small the original problem had seemed, just a car parked in the wrong place. Yet that moment exposed how easily authority could drift without accountability. The real outcome wasn't humiliation or victory. It was change. Because communities aren't protected by rules alone. They're protected by people willing to question how those rules are used. And sometimes, all it takes to restore fairness is one person refusing to move out of the way when power expects silence.